White Boy Rick is a 2018 crime drama that tells the real story of Richard "Ricky" Wershe Jr. and while some of the facts are altered for dramatic effect, much of the incredible story is true to history. White Boy Rick is a movie based on the unbelievable true story of Richard Wershe Jr. who, at age 14, became the youngest FBI informant ever. His story, from helping his father run illegal gun rings to becoming one of the biggest dealers in Detroit, is one almost too outrageous and too unfair to be believed. Matthew McConaughey stars in this movie as Richard "Rick" Wershe Sr. and his son is played by Richie Mera, who appeared in 2 episodes of Euphoria as Bruce Jr. White Boy Rick begins in 1984, at the height of the crack epidemic in the United States and sees Ricky Jr. transform from a young boy trying to help his dad into an enterprising and successful drug dealer. White Boy Rick is never going to make a list of the most accurate movies based on real events, but there are still parts that ring true to the actual story. Richard Wershe Sr. got his son into the drug game. The FBI initially approached the father for help. The most glaring change from reality in White Boy Rick is its portrayal of Rick Sr. in the film. Ricky helps his father with his gun smuggling business. When the FBI gets wise, they're in touch with Ricky and tell him if he becomes an informant, they will not press charges against Rick Sr., all unbeknownst to Rick Sr., who has no idea where his son's sudden wealth is coming from. That could not be further from the truth because the FBI contacted Rick Sr. for help as an informant. In fact, they had a long-standing relationship, via Atavist. Since the FBI was mostly concerned with drug rings in Detroit after teaming up with the DEA, a small-timer like Rick who resold guns was not on their radar. They even helped each other out, with the FBI letting Rick know when they had seen his daughter Dawn, who had become addicted to drugs, getting into trouble. The agents went to their old pal hoping he would be able to identify some key figures in the drug rings who lived in the neighborhood. He couldn't, but Ricky could, having gone on most of his father's gun sale trips. The FBI asked Rick if his son could be an informant and when a cash amount was offered, the decision was easy for the senior Wershe. He told writer Evan Hughes in Atavist Now, there was a reason Ricky was so adept at spotting who these drug ring leaders were. He was not a completely innocent kid, and by the time he was 14, Ricky was buddying up with Rudell Boo Curry, R.J. Cilia, and John It Lil Man Curry's, Jonathan Majors, crew and younger family members, learning how to commit burglaries. Boo and Lil Man were part of a family of drug dealers and one of the top outfits in the city, and Richard Wershe Jr. had an inside track. The young man seemed happy to help the FBI as he told Hughes, what kid doesn't want to be an undercover cop when he's 14, 15 years old? The press gave Richard Wershe Jr. the name White Boy Rick. White Boy Rick was not a street name. Richard Wershe Sr., Matthew McConaughey, and Richard Wershe Jr., Richie Merritt, wearing a gaudy suit in White Boy Rick. While the name White Boy Rick may sound like a moniker earned from working on the street, or at least a name given to him by the FBI, it was actually a creation of the press, via Detroit Free Press. The name stuck, and it does make for an excellent movie title. Richard Wershe Jr. uncovered a Detroit police scandal. The FBI stumbled upon a citywide cover-up thanks to Ricky. Matthew McConaughey as Richard Wershe Sr. and Richie Merritt as Richard Wershe Jr. standing together in White Boy Rick. What no one expected to happen was for Richard Wershe Jr. to inadvertently uncover a Detroit police scandal, one of the biggest corruption scandals in history, via the New York Times. Ricky heard from some other dealers that they had shot and killed a 13-year-old boy over a drug dispute, and he took this information to his FBI handlers. The FBI realized that the Detroit police had been covering up crimes involving the Curry brothers, as Johnny Curry was engaged to the mayor's niece, Kathy Volsan. They were deliberately obfuscating evidence surrounding the brothers. Understanding they had a major corruption scandal on their hands, but to press charges, the FBI would need to admit they had been illegally using an undercover minor all this time. So, they dropped Ricky. Living most of his young life under the watchful protection of the FBI, Ricky was now alone with no skills except the ones he had learned from the FBI, that is, how to sell drugs in order to get close to the gangs. Attempts were made on Richard Wershe Jr.'s life. Ricky survived at least one shooting. Richard Wershe Jr., Richie Merritt, standing on a street corner in White Boy Rick. When news started to filter out about White Boy Rick, the young dealer suddenly had a target on his back. Ricky told CNN a story about being called to a house after the FBI let him go. He was in the basement of the house when an associate of his called him up. Ricky was greeted by a .357 Magnum bullet which tore a hole through his large intestines. Ricky said about the shooting,